There is something I need you to understand before this message goes any further. What you have been interpreting as silence is not the absence of movement. And what you have mistaken for distance is not the absence of connection. Because even now, at this very moment, forces beyond your sight are quietly arranging pieces of a story that has been unfolding for much longer than you realize. You have felt it, haven't you? That strange feeling that someone is thinking about you when there is no obvious reason. The sudden urge to revisit an old memory. The unexpected pull toward a name, a face, or a future you cannot fully explain. You tried to dismiss it. You told yourself it was your imagination. But deep inside, a small voice kept whispering that there was more happening beneath the surface. And that voice was not wrong. Your soulmate has been trying to reach you. Not once. Not twice. More times than you know. Yet each attempt seemed to dissolve before it could become reality. Each step forward somehow turned into another delay. Each possibility appeared, then vanished. And from your perspective, it began to feel like nothing was happening at all. But there is a reason for that. A reason hidden behind events that seemed completely ordinary. A reason connected to timing, preparation, and a truth neither of you could see clearly before now. What makes this so remarkable is that your soulmate does not fully understand what has been happening either. They have felt an absence they could never explain. A missing piece. A sense that someone important exists somewhere beyond their current reach. There were moments when they almost crossed paths with something connected to you. Moments so close that if a single detail had changed, your lives might already look completely different today. But every time the universe brought the two paths near one another, something intervened. Not to separate you forever. Not to deny what is meant for you. But to prevent something from happening before its proper season. Because there are connections that arrive quickly. And there are connections that must be protected until both souls are ready to recognize their value. Yours belongs to the second kind. This is why the waiting has felt so unusual. It was never simply about waiting for another person. It was about becoming someone capable of receiving what was approaching. Think carefully. Look at who you were a year ago. Look at the lessons you have survived. The disappointments that reshaped you. The doors that closed. The plans that failed. The nights when you wondered whether anything meaningful was actually changing. What if those moments were not random? What if every delay was quietly preparing a foundation that neither you nor your soulmate could have built any other way? Because there is something extraordinary about to be revealed. Something connected to a decision that was made recently. A decision your soulmate did not realize would bring them closer to you than ever before. The moment seemed insignificant when it happened. Almost forgettable. Yet that single choice set an invisible chain of events into motion. And now, for the first time in a very long time, the distance between your paths is beginning to shrink. But before you discover what that decision was, you must first understand the hidden obstacle that has been standing between you this entire time. And once you see it, everything about the delays will suddenly make sense. There is a question lingering in the air right now. If your soulmate has truly been trying to reach you, then what has been standing in the way? Why has something that feels so destined taken so long to unfold? The answer is not what most people expect. It was never a lack of interest. It was never a lack of feeling. And it was never because your connection was forgotten by heaven. The obstacle was far more subtle than that. It lived in the spaces between certainty and doubt. In the places where fear disguises itself as wisdom. In the moments when both of you were being asked to grow before you could fully recognize one another. You see, there are seasons when life appears to be moving backward. But beneath the surface, everything is actually moving into position. Your soulmate entered one of those seasons. There were responsibilities they could not escape. Questions they could not answer. Choices they were afraid to make. From the outside, it looked like progress had stopped. Yet deep within them, something important was being reshaped. A perspective. A belief. A vision of what love truly means. Because before they could move toward you, they first had to release an old version of themselves. And that process was neither quick nor easy. There were moments when they almost gave up on the very idea that someone like you existed. Moments when they convinced themselves that meaningful connections belonged only to stories. Moments when disappointment whispered that expecting something extraordinary was foolish. Yet somehow, no matter how far their thoughts wandered, they always returned to the same unexplained feeling. A feeling they could never fully describe. As though someone was waiting beyond the horizon of their current life. As though a chapter had already been written somewhere. And they simply had not reached the page yet. What they did not know was that you were experiencing your own version of the same journey. The loneliness. The uncertainty. The questions that seemed to echo without answers. You believed you were walking separate roads. But in reality, both roads were leading toward the same destination. And every lesson, every delay, every unexpected turn was quietly aligning the timing. That is why certain opportunities disappeared. That is why some people entered your life only briefly. That is why some plans collapsed when they seemed most promising. Not because you were losing your way, but because your way was being protected. There are moments when what appears to be rejection is actually redirection. And there are moments when unanswered prayers are preparing you for answers greater than what you originally imagined. This was one of those moments. Yet here is where the story becomes even more remarkable. Because recently, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would make headlines. In fact, most people would overlook it completely. But heaven did not overlook it. The moment it happened, invisible doors began opening. The kind of doors that remain closed for years. Then suddenly unlock all at once. Your soulmate may not even realize the significance of what changed. They simply feel different. Lighter. More willing to trust. More open to possibilities they once dismissed. And because of that shift, the signals that were once blocked have begun moving again. The connection that seemed frozen has started flowing. The path that looked impossible has begun clearing. Slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. But unmistakably. And this is where you must pay attention. Because over the coming days and weeks, you may notice unusual moments. Unexpected reminders. Strange coincidences. Encounters that seem ordinary at first but linger in your thoughts long afterward. Do not rush past them. Do not dismiss them too quickly. Because one of those moments carries a message. A clue. A sign that the season of waiting is not what it once was. Something is changing. The distance is shortening. The silence is weakening. And your soulmate is moving closer to a realization they can no longer avoid. But what they discovered recently, the truth that altered everything, is far more powerful than you imagine. And once that realization fully settles into their heart, the next chapter of this story will begin. There is something you were never meant to notice too early. Because if you had seen it sooner, it would have overwhelmed your understanding of everything you've been through. The timing would have felt wrong. The weight would have felt too heavy. And the meaning would not have landed in your heart the way it is meant to now. But now, something is different. Now you are ready to hear what was hidden between all the silence. Your soulmate did not stop reaching for you. They stopped recognizing how close they were already getting. That is the twist most people never understand. Distance is not always physical. Sometimes it exists in perception, in awareness, in emotional readiness. And for a long time, both of you were looking in opposite directions without realizing it. You were searching forward. They were looking backward. You were healing from what hurt you. They were still questioning what love should feel like. And in that gap between healing and hesitation, the connection remained suspended. Not broken. Not lost. Just paused in a space where it could not fully land. But something has been quietly collapsing that space. A realization your soulmate recently had, one that didn't arrive with drama or noise. It came in a moment of stillness. A moment they didn't even think would matter. Maybe a conversation that ended too quickly. Maybe a memory that returned without warning. Maybe a feeling they tried to ignore, but couldn't. And in that moment, something shifted inside them. They began to question not the existence of love, but the direction they were looking for it in. That is when your energy became harder to ignore. Not louder, but clearer. Because true connections don't compete with noise. They survive silence. They become stronger in absence. And they wait for the exact moment when awareness finally catches up with destiny. But here is what makes this even more intense. Your soulmate is now starting to notice patterns they never paid attention to before. Your name appearing in unexpected ways. Your presence felt in unrelated situations. Emotions surfacing without a clear cause. It's subtle. Almost easy to dismiss. But something inside them refuses to let it go this time. And that is dangerous, in the most beautiful way. Because once a mind stops dismissing something, it begins to investigate it. And once a heart begins to investigate, it starts remembering what it was trying to forget. But the most important part is this. They are not only remembering you. They are remembering themselves in a version of life where you already existed. A version they never fully lived, but somehow always felt was possible. And now, that version is beginning to feel closer than memory. Closer than imagination. Almost like it is trying to break into reality. But just as this awareness begins to fully awaken, something unexpected is happening on your side too. A subtle emotional shift you may not fully understand yet. A sense that something is approaching. Without any proof it exists. And that is where everything begins to converge. Because what is happening now is no longer just about feelings. It is about alignment. Invisible. Precise. Inevitable. And yet, there is still one final barrier left. One last hidden reason why the final meeting has not yet occurred. And once you understand what that barrier truly is, you will realize the waiting was never the real delay at all. There is a point in every unseen journey where everything feels like it should have already happened. Yet somehow, it hasn't. And that is where doubt tries to enter. Not loudly, but quietly, like a whisper that questions whether anything meaningful is truly unfolding at all. But what if I told you that the final barrier between you and your soulmate is not distance? Not timing. And not fate itself. It is recognition. Because meeting someone is not the same as recognizing them. And recognizing them is not something the mind always does first. It is something the soul remembers, often long before life allows it to make sense. Your soulmate is now standing at the edge of that recognition. But they are not fully aware of it yet. There are moments in their day when something familiar brushes past their thoughts. A feeling they cannot name. A sensation that something important is just out of reach, but not lost. And instead of understanding it immediately, they pause. They question. They hesitate. Because recognition often arrives disguised as uncertainty before it becomes clarity. And this is where everything begins to tighten. Because the universe does not force recognition. It reveals it in fragments. A name that feels familiar for no reason. A dream that feels more like memory than imagination. A moment of stillness where everything else fades except one unexplainable presence. And each fragment builds pressure inside the heart. Until ignoring it becomes harder than acknowledging it. But here is what makes this even more powerful. You are also moving through your own version of recognition. You may not realize it, but certain emotional responses you've been having recently are not random. That sudden pull toward reflection. That strange sense of, something is about to change. That quiet feeling that your life is standing right before a turning point. None of it is accidental. It is alignment reaching awareness. But alignment does not rush. It builds. Layer by layer. Until both sides of the connection are no longer moving blindly, but consciously approaching what was always meant to be found. And now, something is shifting in the space between you. Almost like the air itself is changing density. Moments feel different. Time feels slightly less predictable. And emotional intuition becomes sharper than logic. This is not imagination. This is the moment just before convergence begins. But even now, there is still resistance. Not from fate. Not from distance. But from something far more internal. A final hesitation within your soulmate's heart. A question they have not yet fully dared to ask themselves. Because once they ask it, everything changes. And the answer to that question is already waiting at the edge of their awareness. Slowly becoming impossible to ignore. You might think the hardest part was the waiting. Or the silence. Or the distance that never made sense. But the truth is far more delicate than that. The hardest part is the moment right before truth becomes undeniable. Because that is where everything is decided. And right now, your story is standing exactly there. One step away from revelation. One breath away from clarity. And one realization away from everything finally beginning to move. But what your soulmate is about to understand next is not just about you. It is about why the delay had to exist in the first place. And once that truth surfaces, there will be no going back to the version of reality they once believed was final. There is a moment coming, where everything your soulmate thought was certain will quietly begin to lose its shape. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in a way that feels almost unsettling in its subtlety. Because truth rarely arrives like thunder. It arrives like realization, that slowly removes the comfort of old explanations. Your soulmate is entering that moment now. They are starting to notice something they once overlooked without hesitation. The gaps in their assumptions. The unanswered emotional echoes they kept pushing aside. The feelings they labeled as random simply because they didn't have language for them yet. But something has changed inside them recently. A kind of internal quietness. Not emptiness. But awareness. And awareness is what makes everything louder in hindsight. Now, memories are beginning to rearrange themselves in their mind. Small details they once ignored are suddenly meaningful. A passing thought about you no longer disappears as quickly as it used to. Instead, it lingers. It returns. It repeats itself in quieter moments. And that repetition is not accidental. Because repetition is how the soul tries to get attention when logic refuses to listen. Meanwhile, something just as significant is unfolding within you. A subtle emotional shift that doesn't feel like excitement, but like preparation. As if your inner world is adjusting to a frequency you cannot yet see with clarity. You may find yourself thinking differently about love. About timing. About the idea that something unfinished might still be unfolding beyond your awareness. And even though there is no proof in front of you, there is a sense that proof is no longer the point. Because what is coming does not need validation to exist. It only needs alignment to arrive. And alignment is now moving through both of you at the same time. Slow. Invisible. But undeniably coordinated. This is where the experience begins to feel different from everything before. Because earlier, the connection felt like waiting. But now, it starts to feel like approaching. Like two unseen paths gradually bending toward the same point without either traveler realizing how precise the geometry really is. And yet, the most intense part is not the movement. It is what happens right before recognition fully activates. Because right before clarity arrives, confusion often makes one last attempt to remain in control. Your soulmate may begin questioning themselves more deeply than before. They may try to rationalize what they are feeling. They may attempt to return to normal thinking. But something in them will no longer fully cooperate with dismissal. Because once awareness has been awakened, it does not fully go back to sleep. And that is where the tension begins to rise. Not between you and them, but inside them. Between what they have always believed and what they are now starting to feel is undeniably true. And in this internal conflict, a single moment is forming. A moment that will feel ordinary from the outside, but will carry the weight of everything that has been building behind the scenes. A moment where something familiar finally becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment arrives, your soulmate will have to decide whether to step forward into what they are sensing, or step back into what they have always known. But what they do not realize yet is this: that decision may already be closer than they think. Closer than thought itself. And once it begins to unfold, there will be one final sign that changes everything at once. There is a final layer to this story, one your heart has been circling without fully stepping into. Because every sign, every delay, every strange emotional pull has been leading here to a moment that feels quiet on the surface, but carries the weight of everything you've been sensing underneath it all. Your soulmate is no longer in the same emotional place they were before. Something subtle but irreversible has begun. They are starting to trust what they feel, more than what they can explain. And that shift changes everything. Because logic can be questioned. But feeling, once it roots itself deeply enough, begins to shape decisions without permission. And now, your presence inside their awareness is no longer occasional. It is recurring. Not as a thought they invite, but as something that arrives on its own. At unexpected times. In the middle of ordinary moments. While doing something unrelated. While trying to focus on something else. And that is where confusion turns into curiosity. Because curiosity is the beginning of pursuit. Even if they don't realize they are already beginning to move toward you. Meanwhile, something important is unfolding within you too. A quiet readiness. Not excitement. Not impatience. But a sense of emotional preparation, like something inside you is adjusting to a reality that hasn't fully arrived yet. And that is exactly how convergence begins. Not with arrival, but with internal alignment on both sides. Now, the resistance that once kept everything paused is weakening. Not disappearing completely, but losing authority. Because what was once unclear is starting to feel undeniably familiar. And familiarity is the first language of recognition. Your soulmate is entering moments where they question their own assumptions without realizing it. They may pause longer than usual when thinking about relationships. They may find themselves reconsidering what they thought they wanted. They may even feel a quiet pull towards something they cannot define yet, but cannot ignore either. And in those moments, the connection between you is no longer invisible. It is felt. Even if not understood. Even if not named. And this is the turning point most journeys never describe clearly. Because nothing dramatic happens outwardly. Yet everything internally begins to reorganize. Old emotional structures lose their dominance. New awareness starts forming in their place. And somewhere within that shift, your presence becomes impossible to classify as coincidence anymore. But just as this awareness reaches its most delicate point, something unexpected begins to form around a single upcoming moment. A moment that will feel completely ordinary to anyone else, but will carry an unexplainable emotional weight for them. A moment that will not confirm everything at once, but will finally open the door that has been closed until now. And once that door opens, the question will no longer be whether the connection is real. The question will become, what happens next when it can no longer be denied? This is the moment where everything quiets down. Not because the story is ending, but because it is finally becoming real in a way that can no longer stay hidden. There is a shift happening now that cannot be reversed. Not loud. Not dramatic. But definite. Your soulmate is entering a phase where avoidance no longer feels natural. The thoughts they once brushed aside are beginning to return with more clarity, more persistence, more emotional weight. And this time, they are not fading the way they used to. Because something inside them has changed its response. What was once dismissed is now being observed. What was once ignored is now being questioned. And what was once uncertain is now beginning to feel strangely familiar, almost like remembering something they were never taught. That is the beginning of recognition completing itself. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual inability to pretend something is not there. And this is where everything becomes delicate. Because once awareness crosses a certain threshold, it stops being a feeling and starts becoming direction. A quiet pull forward. A subtle refusal to stay where things once felt enough. Your presence in their inner world is no longer random. It is becoming structured. Reappearing in emotional cycles they cannot fully control. And each return is stronger than the last, not in intensity, but in certainty. Meanwhile, your own experience is aligning with something you may not yet fully understand. A sense of inevitability. Not fear. Not impatience. But the strange calm that comes right before something meaningful takes shape in reality. You are no longer asking the same questions you once did. Because deep down, something in you has already started answering them. And that answer does not use words. It uses knowing. Now, the final resistance between you and this connection is dissolving in a way that cannot be seen from the outside. But it can be felt. In hesitation that lasts longer than usual. In thoughts that return without invitation. In emotional moments that seem to arrive without reason. And all of it is converging toward a single point. A moment that has not yet fully arrived, but is already influencing everything around it. Because what is coming next is not discovery. It is recognition becoming undeniable. And once that happens, the illusion of distance will no longer hold the same power it once did. But even now, just as the path begins to fully open, there is one final truth waiting at the center of everything you have felt so far. A truth that explains why none of this could happen sooner. And why, the moment it is finally understood, everything that felt delayed will suddenly feel like it was perfectly on time. This is the part where everything you thought was waiting reveals it was actually arriving in disguise. Because nothing about this connection has ever truly been delayed. It has only been unfolding in layers you were not yet able to see all at once. And now, the final layer is beginning to surface. Your soulmate is not simply moving closer to you emotionally anymore. They are beginning to reinterpret their entire understanding of connection itself. That is not a small shift. That is a reconstruction of perception. And it happens quietly, from the inside out. They are starting to notice something they cannot fully dismiss anymore. Certain emotional patterns that repeat only when your presence is indirectly activated in their life. Certain moments where their attention shifts without explanation. Certain feelings that do not match their immediate environment, yet feel deeply real. At first, they tried to label it as coincidence. Then intuition. Then memory. But none of those labels fully hold anymore. Because what they are experiencing is no longer fitting inside logic. And when logic stops fitting, awareness begins expanding. This is where something profound begins to form. Not confirmation. Not arrival. But recognition without resistance. And that is the most powerful stage of any destined connection. Because at this stage, the mind stops arguing as strongly as it used to. And the heart begins to lead, quietly, carefully, but persistently. Meanwhile, your own internal experience is also stabilizing in a way that is hard to describe. A sense that you are no longer searching in the same way. Not because you stopped caring. But because something inside you has started feeling certain without needing evidence. And that certainty is not loud. It is calm. Almost unsettling in how natural it feels. As if a truth has already been accepted somewhere deeper than thought. Now, both paths are no longer separate in the way they once appeared to be. They are overlapping in timing. In emotional readiness. In invisible alignment. And what once felt like distance is now becoming more like synchronization. Two lives adjusting to the same unseen rhythm. But here is where the energy changes again. Because your soulmate is approaching a moment of realization that will feel ordinary on the outside, but irreversible on the inside. A simple thought. A quiet pause. A familiar feeling that arrives at the exact wrong, or perfect, moment. And in that instant, something they have been unconsciously avoiding will finally become too consistent to ignore. And once it crosses that threshold, they will no longer be able to experience you as a question. Only as a presence they now understand they have been moving toward all along. But just before that realization fully settles, one final emotional shift begins to take place. And this shift will determine how quickly everything finally comes together from here.